The horizon of the Promised Land was not a green pasture, but a jagged line of stone teeth, where from Hazor in the north to Lachish in the south, the landscape was dominated by citadels that defied the very concept of conquest. These were not merely towns with fences, they were massive, artificial mountains known as tells, where a traveller in the late Bronze Age would look up and see the terrifying feat of engineering called a glacis. This steep, artificial slope of packed earth and stone was coated in slick, sun-baked plaster that shone in the heat, creating a design as simple as it was lethal. It was intended to be impossible to climb, acting as a vertical barrier that stripped an attacking soldier of both his footing and his courage long before he reached the foundation of the wall. Because gravity was the primary weapon of the Canaanite kings, the idea of an invading force scaling those slopes appeared to be a strategic absurdity. These cities were built on limestone bedrock over natural spring systems, making them impervious to the common siege tactic of cutting off the water supply, while a small handful of archers on the parapets could command a valley and turn a massive army into a target range. While the sheer physical horror of these walls was the primary obstacle, making the prospect of taking the hill country appear to be an act of suicide rather than military strategy, one must look at the kill box the Canaanites had engineered to turn every entry point into a graveyard to understand how a ragtag force even contemplated an assault. The question of how this force could possibly bypass such death traps will be resolved when we see the true source of their victory. The gates of these cities were marvels of defensive architecture designed to ensure that no enemy ever penetrated the inner sanctum, utilizing a bent-axis entry system that forced an attacker to turn 90 degrees multiple times while moving through a narrow, stone-lined corridor. In this confined space, the soldier was forced to expose his right side, which was the side not protected by his shield, to the spears and blades of the defenders standing on the overhead battlements. It was a perfectly calculated slaughterhouse, where the layout of the stone itself acted as a weapon against the invader. As the infantry trudged toward the mountain routes, their movement across the lowlands became an exercise in extreme exposure, constantly watched by the Canaanite chariot patrols that dominated the plains. Beyond the gates, the Canaanites controlled the valley floors with fleets of iron chariots that functioned as the tanks of the ancient world. These chariots moved with terrifying speed, turning the flat plains into death zones for any infantry caught out in the open, while the hill country served as a secure refuge where the kings could retreat into mountain fortresses if the lowlands were threatened. Every detail of this environment was crafted to serve the maintenance of a rigid tax-collecting empire that demanded total submission. Yet the Canaanites, who believed they had mastered the physics of war, failed to account for a group that lacked the traditional military trappings of the age. As they watched the Israelites approach from the wilderness, they saw a group that lacked chariots, heavy armor, and the siege towers required for a professional conquest. But as these bronze-armored defenders looked down from their ramparts, the true depth of the crisis was not just the height of the walls, but the fact that the Israelite infantry standing below them possessed nothing in their arsenal that could breach a single gate. As we unpack how such impossible barriers were dismantled, consider subscribing to the channel to continue this journey through the hidden tactical realities of the biblical narrative, as we must determine if any force, human or divine, can possibly break these gates before the entire mission collapses. The contrast between the two armies was defined by the gap between sophisticated metallurgy and simple survival. For while the Canaanite soldiers were draped in scale armor with bronze weapons glinting in the sun, the Israelites were a band of former slaves carrying slings, wooden bows, and crude swords, A professional soldier from the hill country was a master of fortress life, trained in a culture that viewed war as a high-stakes competition of structural engineering, whereas Israel moved through the land as a population that depended entirely on the daily provision of the manna. Their path wound through the rocky crags, forcing them away from the easy roads and into the suffocating terrain of the mountains, where their lack of heavy equipment made every step a labor of endurance. Although their scouts had infiltrated these cities and risked their lives to map out the triple gate systems and hidden water shafts, they returned with a report that would have shattered a secular army, for they saw giant walls and impenetrable gates that proved they were outmatched by every standard of the ancient world. Because a military campaign requires a secure line of communication, a steady stream of grain, and the ability to batter down fortifications, Israel was, by all accounts, a disaster waiting to happen. They were caught between the iron chariot-controlled plains and the vertical stone-walled citadels of the mountains, essentially acting as a nomadic people trying to topple the most advanced defensive network of their era with nothing but their faith in an invisible commander. This tension defined every step toward the fortresses, creating a scenario where every single stone they breached was a physical monument to a reality that defied human military logic. The people were forced to learn that when they relied on their own strategy, like the disastrous attempt to take the city of Ai, they were crushed by the superior defensive positioning of their enemies, forcing them to understand that their strength was not in their ability to build a better battering ram, but in their willingness to move according to a divine rhythm that did not obey the physics of bronze and stone. The moment those men stopped measuring the height of the fortifications against the strength of their own short swords, and instead anchored their movement to the manna-based logistics of a god who transcends physics, the massive stone citadels they faced ceased to be obstacles and became nothing more than hollow monuments to a defeated philosophy. We return to the jagged line of stone teeth mentioned at the start, now realizing those teeth could not bite back against the mandate of heaven. The collapse of these strongholds was not a process of wear and tear, but a sudden unraveling of the Canaanite dream of invincibility. When the command was issued in Joshua 11 to hamstring the horses and burn the chariots, it was an explicit rejection of the military doctrine that the Canaanites used to control the region. As the path of the conquest turned from the high mountain passes down into the heart of the enemy strongholds, the smoking remains of the Canaanite military machine were left in the wake of the advancing Israelites. By destroying the equipment that represented the peak of Bronze Age technology, Israel declared that their victory was won by an architect who did not use iron wheels or battering rams. The mountain citadels were designed to inspire fear, acting as a form of architectural terrorism that kept the people in a state of constant submission, but they proved powerless against an army that recognized their own weakness as their greatest asset. It is a profound irony that the most fortified region in the world fell to a group that was supposed to be easily swept away by the chariot forces of the plain, especially since the water shafts meant to keep the cities alive during a 2-year siege became useless when the battle was decided in a matter of hours. The Canaanite king, sitting in his inner chamber and surrounded by the best security that human ingenuity could provide, found himself entirely exposed to a force that operated outside the conventional boundaries of war. This was the ultimate high-value lesson for the people of Israel, who realized that the walls they had once seen as impossible hurdles were only as strong as the fear they instilled in the hearts of the attackers. As the sun set over the ruined gates of these mountain strongholds, the remnants of the defensive systems lay in silence, replaced by the quiet realization that the conquest was not about conquering ground, but about exposing the fragility of human power when it stands in opposition to the divine. The ragtag force succeeded because the siege was never their own. but a divine dismantling of human pride. This historical reality serves as a permanent anchor for the faith of those who look back at the hill country, showing that even the most formidable fortresses can be reduced to dust when they are placed in the path of a purpose that originates beyond the constraints of human history. The impossible siege was never really a battle of steel, but a battle of perspective, proving that the most secure walls in the world are ultimately nothing more than fragile shells when they are built against the sovereignty of the Creator. Thus, the conquest of the hill country stands as a testament to the fact that the most sophisticated barriers in existence are merely temporary, and that the only truly impregnable fortress is the one built upon a foundation of absolute radical trust. By standard human measures, Israel should have been destroyed in the foothills. Yet they emerged as a nation because they chose to fight in a way that defied every military manual of the age, leaving the ruins of the Canaanite citadels as a silent warning to any who would try to build their safety on anything less than the truth. The narrative of the hill country is not a story of a better army winning, but of a broken people witnessing the systematic dismantling of a worldly empire by the only power that does not require iron or stone to achieve its ends. Every wall that was breached served to prove that the height of the Glacis, the strength of the gate, and the speed of the chariot are meaningless when the power that established the mountains chooses to intervene on behalf of the faithful. This is why Israel could never have conquered the hill country by human standards, and why the history of that land will always remain the most powerful argument for the reality of an unseen, intervening presence. The impossible siege remains the clearest lens through which to view the truth that the most intimidating barriers in life are destined to fail whenever they are set against the reality of a divine plan. As the dust settled over the mountain paths, the world learned that human defenses are nothing more than stagecraft, easily discarded by the one who holds the power to humble the high and exalt the low, proving forever that the impossible siege is simply another word for a miracle that human history refuses to explain. The fortresses that were designed to stand for 1,000 years fell in a fraction of a generation, teaching us that the only real security is found in the willingness to let go of our own defensive systems and step forward into the reality that the strongest walls are those we build in our own minds, while the only walls that truly matter are those destined to fall. The gates we once feared have been unlocked, and the secret of their failure is now revealed. By the time the last gate was closed and the last chariot was burned, it was clear that the geography of the Promised Land had been rewritten, not by the strength of a sword, but by the weight of a faith that moved the very mountains the Canaanites had spent centuries perfecting. The story of the hill country is the story of the end of human arrogance and the beginning of a new way of existing in a world where the impossible is not a barrier, but a threshold. As we conclude, tell us in the comments, which modern-day stronghold do you find most difficult to surrender to God's providence? This realization is the ultimate key to understanding the impossible siege and the enduring truth that the strongest fortress is not made of stone, but of a spirit that has finally stopped trusting in the walls of the world to keep it safe.